Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When I stepped into the lobby of Echelon Partners, I could already feel the weight of the place pressing down like a glass dome, silent, polished, immaculate, in that sterile way only high-end corporate spaces manage to be. There was a chill in the air that wasn't just from the air conditioning. It came from the kind of money that didn't speak loudly, but instead hummed around you like it was watching, judging, quietly calculating whether you belonged there at all. I adjusted my blazer, navy blue, not too tight, not too formal, and walked up to the reception desk with the same quiet determination that had carried me through worse places than this. Crisis centers, courtrooms, the back rooms of halfway houses. Places where you had to prove yourself with actions, not outfits or polish. The receptionist looked up, scanning me with the kind of pleasant indifference I had come to expect from people who spent their entire day behind glossy white counters. I gave her my name, Dana Caldwell, and she nodded, checked a screen I couldn't see, and gestured toward a pair of leather chairs near the windows. "Someone will be down in a few minutes," she said, not unkindly, but not exactly with warmth either. I sat, crossed my legs carefully, and tried to quiet my heartbeat, which had taken on a rhythm that felt just a little too fast. I had done interviews before, plenty, but this one felt different. Not because of the position itself, but because of who worked upstairs. My sister, Ava. It's strange how blood can bind you and strangle you at the same time. Ava and I had grown up in the same small house, with the same plastic-wrapped furniture and the same Sunday roast dinners. But somehow, we had walked two entirely different paths. She had always been the one with the spotlight, cheer captain, prom queen, business degree from a private college with stone columns and legacy scholarships. She had a knack for walking into a room and making it hers. Before she even spoke, like the air bent around her confidence and carried her forward. I, on the other hand, had found meaning in the quiet corners, volunteering in shelters, studying psychology at a state school, working my way through counseling programs, while Ava climbed corporate ladders that never seemed to have rungs missing. I hadn't told her I was coming. The job listing had come through a nonprofit newsletter I subscribed to, of all places, tucked between articles on burnout and self-care. It was a new position, Strategic Outreach Director for Echelon's Mental Health Initiative, and it felt like a strange kind of fate. I had clicked apply without thinking, and now here I was surrounded by brushed steel and glass, pretending I didn't already know how the interview would go if Ava had any say in it. And of course she did. Her heels clicked before I even saw her. That unmistakable rhythm of authority trying too hard to sound effortless. When I looked up, there she was, flawless as ever, in a gray blazer so sharply tailored it looked like it could cut through drywall, makeup immaculate, lips curved in the kind of smile people mistake for warmth when they don't know her. She raised her eyebrows like she was surprised to see me, which I didn't buy for a second. "Dana," she said, in that voice she used for networking events, smooth as cream but with an edge if you knew where to listen. What a surprise. I stood because I was raised that way, and offered a small smile. "I didn't realize you'd be down here." "Oh, I heard from HR that you were coming in. Thought I'd say hello, offer support." The way she said support made it sound like a threat, or maybe a favor I hadn't earned. She turned to the receptionist and added with a quick glance back at me, "This is my sister. I'll be sitting in on her interview." I blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to do that." "Nonsense," she replied, waving a manicured hand like my words didn't matter. "I'm involved with the initiative. It's part of my portfolio now. Better I be there to help bridge the context." The receptionist didn't question it, just nodded and made a note on her screen. I sat back down, this time trying to control my breathing, which had picked up again. Ava remained standing, pulling out her phone like she had better things to do, but was making time for me anyway. She said after a pause, eyes still on the screen, "this is a big opportunity, high visibility. I had to pull some strings even to get them to look at outside candidates." I said nothing because there was nothing to say. Her words hung in the air like a net, woven with implication, You owe me. You're only here because of me. You don't belong here unless I allow it. It was all the same music, just a new arrangement. I wanted to tell her I had applied anonymously. I wanted to tell her I hadn't used her name, not once, that I had earned my way in the old-fashioned way, with a resume and a track record, and stories from the field that didn't fit neatly into PowerPoint slides. I wanted to tell her that she had no idea what I was capable of, because she had spent our entire lives refusing to look past the version of me she had decided fit her narrative. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I waited. A junior associate appeared from the elevator, all nervous energy and apologetic smiles, and gestured for us to follow him upstairs. I stood, brushed invisible lint from my lap, and walked beside Ava into the elevator. She leaned in just as the doors closed and whispered, "Don't screw this up. I'm putting my name on the line for you." I turned toward her and met her eyes for the first time that morning. And though I said nothing, the weight of what I didn't say must have reached her, because for a moment, just a flicker, she looked uncertain. We rode to the top floor in silence. Neither of us noticed that the associate didn't press a button. He'd used a key card. The top floor wasn't accessible to just anyone, and neither of us realized, not yet, that I wasn't the one who'd be answering questions in that room. Not at first, not at all. The conference room was one of those spaces designed to quietly overwhelm you without saying a word. The kind of place where the air is too clean, the silence feels loaded, and even the water bottles look like they cost more than your shoes. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around two sides of the room, displaying a panoramic view of the city that made everything below seem impossibly far away and insignificant. There was a polished walnut table that stretched nearly the length of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs so sleek they practically dared you to relax. At the far end of the table sat 3 people, each wearing a tailored suit, each projecting the calm, efficient confidence of individuals who had long ago stopped needing to introduce themselves. Ava walked in first, all curated presence and precise posture, her smile calibrated for maximum strategic warmth. She made a show of greeting the 2 executives seated near the head of the table, offering one a compliment on her shoes and asking the other about some recent panel he'd appeared on. And it all happened so smoothly that I had the sinking realization she must have done it 1,000 times before. She belonged here, or at least she believed she did, and belief in this world counted for almost everything. I followed a few steps behind, keeping my shoulders straight and my face neutral, refusing to let the butterflies in my stomach win. I was used to high-pressure situations. Working in crisis intervention meant learning to stay calm while a teenager held a blade to his own throat, while a woman whispered for help from a locked bathroom with her abuser just outside the door. But nothing in those moments ever felt quite like the quiet humiliation that came from walking into a room where your own sister had already decided you didn't belong. At the head of the table, a man I recognized from the company's leadership page stood and offered his hand. Richard Ellison, CEO, founder. The man who had built Echelon from a 2-person consultancy into a global strategic powerhouse, known for his sharp instincts, philanthropic endeavors, and absolutely no tolerance for mediocrity. He was older than I'd expected, maybe mid-60s, with silver hair and deep-set eyes that missed nothing. His handshake was firm, but not performative, and for a brief moment, his gaze lingered on me like he was trying to place a memory that had gone blurry with time. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice even and deliberate, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied, maintaining eye contact and resisting the urge to glance at Ava, who had taken a seat 1 chair down from him as if it were her rightful place. We exchanged pleasantries, the other 2 executives introducing themselves, Margot, the VP of Strategy, and Daniel, Head of Innovation, both clearly curious about why the CEO had chosen to sit in on what was, on paper, an initial interview for a mid-level position. I could feel the unspoken questions bouncing around the room, but no one voiced them, not yet. The formalities lasted no more than 3 minutes before Ava leaned forward slightly, her tone light, but her eyes sharp, Just to clarify, Dana's here through an internal referral, she said, her voice dipping into that falsely humble cadence she used when pretending she wasn't angling for control. I flagged her resume when I saw the posting. She's only here because of me, really. There it was, the dismissal, the dig, the attempt to reframe the entire situation as her act of charity, her version of events where I owed this room, this moment, to her magnanimity. I watched the words land, expecting them to pass like vapor, to be ignored in favor of polite progression to interview questions. But something shifted. Richard Ellison, who had been reviewing my resume, suddenly stopped. His eyes locked on the page in front of him, and then lifted, slowly, deliberately, to look directly at Ava. For a moment, the room felt unnaturally quiet, the way an auditorium goes silent just before the curtain lifts. "No," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "She's here because I owe her my life." Time didn't exactly stop, but it stretched. Ava blinked, clearly caught off guard. The other executives looked at one another, confused but intrigued. I froze in place, my mind racing as I tried to piece together what had just happened. I knew Richard Ellison's name, of course, and I had known Echelon had donated heavily to mental health programs over the years, but I hadn't made a connection, not to him, not to anything personal. And yet here he was saying something that upended every assumption in the room. "You saved my son," he continued, this time addressing me directly, his eyes softer now, but more intense than before. "More than 10 years ago. You probably don't remember his name. It was an overdose, late at night, downtown youth clinic. You stayed with him until the paramedics came. They said he wouldn't have made it if you hadn't kept him awake. You never gave your full name, but last week, when I saw the application and recognized the story in your background, well, I knew exactly who you were." Behind me, Ava sat stone still. She didn't speak. For once, she didn't even pretend to understand what was happening. I saw her lips part slightly, but no sound came out. Richard turned to the two executives. "She's not just a candidate. She's the reason my son got clean. The reason he's alive. The reason I get to see him on Sundays and argue about football and hug my grandchildren. I owe her a debt I can't repay. So if she wants this job, it's hers, but I have a feeling that's not why she came." The room shifted again, this time from surprise to something heavier. Reverence, maybe, or the kind of quiet that comes when people realize the floor beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. I sat still, my hands folded, my heart thudding loud enough that I thought they might hear it. Ava's face was pale. She looked like she wanted to crawl out of her skin. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I remember that night more clearly than I wish I did. The artificial hum of the overhead lights in that cramped, peeling-walled crisis center. The way the fabric on the waiting room chairs always smelled faintly of bleach and despair. And the sheer weight of that shift, like every minute was dragging an anchor behind it. It had been a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday. Honestly, those nights all bled together when I was working at Haven House, a non-profit center that rarely saw the kind of funding or recognition it deserved, where the only currency we could rely on was empathy, and the only weapon we had was patience. I had been logging out when the door banged open, a gust of cold air following a boy who couldn't have been more than 19. His eyes were too wide, too glassy, and his hands shook in that way that said he had pushed his body past the breaking point and had no idea how to stop it now. There had been no drama, no shouting, just a quiet kind of desperation that made my chest tighten the second I saw him. He collapsed into a chair without saying a word, and I remember kneeling down, trying to make eye contact, asking his name, which he didn't give. He kept muttering numbers, strange sequences I later realized were dosages. Pills, something synthetic, something cut with something else, things his body didn't know how to process. I called the paramedics, yes, but they were 27 minutes out, and in that window of time, I sat with him, holding his hand, whispering through his panic, keeping him conscious with stories I made up on the spot about my dog, about fictional baseball games, about anything that would keep him from slipping further into whatever shadow was pulling him under. I remember my knees went numb. I remember the clock ticking so loud it felt like thunder. And I remember most of all the way he finally looked at me. Just once, really looked at me and whispered, "I don't want to die." That was more than a decade ago. The report got filed. The ambulance took him. I never saw him again. We weren't allowed to follow up. Confidentiality, liability, a whole web of laws and red tape meant to protect, but often isolating the people they're written for. He had been a shadow in my past, one of many, and I never thought I'd hear his name again. Until now. Back in that Echelon boardroom, Richard Ellison's voice had dropped in tone, not dramatically, but in that quiet way that makes people lean in. He turned to the others and spoke with a steadiness that surprised me. My son Alex struggled with addiction for years. We didn't talk about it much. In our circles, you don't. People ask questions you don't want to answer, and sometimes you stop seeing your child and start seeing the damage he might do to your reputation. But that night, someone saw the human being in him. Someone chose not to leave him alone with his shame. I watched as Margot, the VP, shifted in her chair, clearly stunned by the personal turn of the conversation. Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped, suddenly alert in a way he hadn't been earlier. Ava, however, sat like stone, her gaze locked on her hands, as though they might rewrite the story that was unfolding in front of her. Richard continued. We only learned the details much later, through fragmented medical notes and third-hand reports. The woman who stayed with him never gave a full name. She clocked out after her shift, didn't take credit, didn't wait for thanks. She did what needed to be done and walked away. When I saw your resume, he looked back at me then, eyes filled with a kind of humble wonder I wasn't used to seeing from powerful men. When I saw the dates, the organization, the location, it all aligned. And when I checked with my son, he confirmed what I already knew. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I hadn't realized I was gripping the armrest until I felt my fingers cramping. There was something surreal about hearing a stranger describe a night that had haunted me in fragments for years. I had buried it in the way you bury so many moments in social work. Quietly, privately, like folding up a letter you're never allowed to send. Ava finally found her voice, although it cracked when she spoke. Why didn't you ever tell us? You could have... She stopped, searching for a way to phrase the accusation that wouldn't sound as petty as it was. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I let all the restraint fall away. Because I wasn't doing it for credit, Ava. It wasn't a resume bullet. It wasn't leverage. It was a life. And maybe you don't understand that, but some of us show up even when there's no applause. Her mouth opened, then closed. No comeback came. Richard turned to her, his tone polite but firm. You said she's here because of you, but I think you owe your position in part to the kind of integrity your sister displayed that night. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of shifting balance, of scales recalibrating, of people realizing that the script they were following had just been rewritten without their permission. It was a silence that tasted like justice. Richard leaned back in his chair and said something no one expected. I'd like to offer Dana a role not just within the department, but on the advisory board for our new mental health foundation. We need people who understand what this work really looks like, not just on paper, but in pain, in sweat, in silence. I didn't look at Ava. I didn't need to. She was already looking at me, but not with the triumph I'd seen so often. This time, her gaze held something different, something like fear. I smiled, not with pride, not with smugness, but with the quiet knowledge that, after all these years, the truth had finally learned how to speak for itself. The knock on my apartment door came just after 9, sharp and impatient. The kind of knock that wasn't really a question, but a demand. And before I even opened it, I knew it was Ava. She had that particular kind of presence that could pass through walls, a static pressure that filled a room before she even stepped inside. I opened the door slowly, not because I was hesitant or afraid, but because I wanted the few extra seconds to prepare for whatever storm she was carrying behind that perfect, calculated expression. She stood there in another one of her blazer and heels combinations, as though she had come directly from a boardroom war and decided to bring the battle to my front porch. "I need to talk to you," she said, pushing past me before I could answer, already in my living room by the time I turned around. I didn't bother pretending to be surprised. I closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, and watched her pace, hands fluttering toward her hair, toward her necklace, toward nothing at all, her movements a map of irritation and disbelief. Ava never visited unannounced. She never came without reason. And now she was in my space, surrounded by thrift store furniture, a bookshelf too full for its frame, and the smell of the coffee I had brewed only 10 minutes earlier, turning my peaceful evening into a confrontation I hadn't asked for, but had long known would come. "You had that story in your pocket all this time," she began, her voice tight, almost breathless, like she had rehearsed these words but was losing grip of them by the second. "You knew what happened. You knew that boy was Ellison's son. You knew exactly what it would mean, and you just, sat on it?" I crossed the room, calmly picked up my coffee, and sat down. I didn't answer right away because I wanted her to feel the space between her anger and my silence. Ava had always rushed to fill silences with her own voice, but this time I let it stretch until her words felt as hollow as they were. "I didn't know he was Richard Ellison's son," I said finally, my tone even, because unlike her, I had spent my life learning how to stay calm when emotions wanted to take the wheel. I didn't recognize the name, not then, not for years. It wasn't until last week when I saw his photo on the company site that I realized who he was. Ava stared at me like she didn't believe me, or didn't want to. She shook her head as if trying to force the story back into a version that made sense to her, one where I had manipulated the truth to steal her spotlight, where I had orchestrated some slow-burn revenge plot to unravel her reputation from the inside. "You should have said something," she said, her voice shaking now, not with sorrow but with rage. "You let me sit there in that room thinking I was the reason you were even at that table, thinking I had some kind of control over the situation, because you needed to believe you had control," I interrupted, not sharply, but with the kind of clarity that stops a person in their tracks. "That's always been the difference between us. You think power is something you own, something you're owed because you built your life around appearances and accolades. But I don't work like that. I don't do things to be noticed. I don't keep score the way you do." She looked like I had slapped her. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. I watched the words die before they could escape, and for once, I didn't feel guilty about it. "You've always thought of me as smaller," I continued, "as the one who didn't try hard enough, who didn't maximize her potential. But the truth is, I just stopped playing the game you were so desperate to win. I chose a different path, one where success isn't measured in promotions or nameplates on glass doors." Ava sat down slowly, like the weight of the room had finally caught up to her. She rubbed her temples, her hands trembling slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, stripped of its usual polish. "I didn't know how to be around you," she admitted, eyes fixed on the rug. "You always seemed so certain, like you knew who you were. I didn't have that. I still don't. Everything I built so people would look at me and see something impressive. But it never feels like enough." That confession, raw and unexpected, hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. It didn't change the years of rivalry and undercutting and bitterness, but it peeled back the mask I had always known was there. Beneath all the power suits and curated social posts, Ava was just as lost as the clients I used to sit beside in the dark, trying to convince them that surviving didn't mean surrendering. "I never wanted to compete with you," I said, my voice softer now. "But you made everything into a scoreboard. You treated my choices like they were insults to yours. You never asked why I stayed in social work, why I put up with the burnout and the chaos. You just assumed it was because I couldn't do better." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, two sisters surrounded by the fragile aftermath of a lifetime's worth of misunderstandings. There was no apology. There was no sudden bond formed over coffee and shared memories. There was just the quiet acknowledgement that something had cracked, not just between us, but inside her, inside both of us, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real. Eventually, Ava stood up. She straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the door with that same practiced grace, but this time, it looked less like confidence and more like armor that no longer fit quite right. Before she left, she turned to me and said, "I don't know who I am if I'm not the one on top." I looked her in the eye and said, "Maybe it's time to find out." She didn't reply, she just nodded once and walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of her expensive perfume and a silence that, for the first time in years, didn't feel heavy. It felt like a clean slate, and I wasn't afraid to write something new on it. It was a week later when I returned to the top floor of Echelon Partners, though this time, the elevator ride felt different. Not rushed or uncertain or brimming with the weight of someone else's narrative, but calm, grounded, and quietly resolute in a way that reminded me of who I had always been, underneath the surface noise of comparison and expectation. I had been invited, not summoned, not interviewed, not tolerated, but truly invited by name to attend the first meeting of Echelon's advisory board for its new mental health foundation, a project born not out of corporate vanity or trend chasing, but out of something deeply personal and real. Richard Ellison had called me himself, not through an assistant or a scheduler, but with a direct voice on the other end of the line, asking me if I would lend not only my perspective, but my voice to shaping what he called a second chance for those who didn't always get a first one. The boardroom looked the same, still drenched in morning light through the massive windows, still full of surfaces too clean to ever feel lived in, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you knew how to feel the current beneath the air. This time, when I walked in, no one looked at me as a question mark. There was no curiosity laced with doubt, no silent calculations of how I had ended up in the room. My nameplate was already on the table, positioned at the right hand of the CEO himself, and beside it sat a folder thick with planning documents and a handwritten note that read, simply, "Thank you, let's build something that matters." As the other members of the board filtered in, academics, clinical experts, policy veterans, and a few private sector names I only vaguely recognized, I caught sight of Ava standing near the glass wall, engaged in hushed conversation with one of the executive vice presidents. She looked different, not disheveled, never that, but quieter, her usual intensity dialed back into something more observant. When our eyes met, she gave the slightest nod, not out of habit or obligation, but something more complicated, a reluctant gesture of recognition that carried more weight than any formal apology ever could. We had not spoken since that night in my apartment, not directly, and I hadn't expected to see her here today. But then again, nothing about this chapter had unfolded the way either of us had planned. The meeting began promptly, with Richard opening the session by introducing each board member by name and background, pausing when he reached me to say, without any dramatic flourish, that my perspective came not from theory or abstraction, but from the lived trenches of human struggle, and that this foundation would be built not just to respond to statistics, but to honor the unseen labor of those who worked in the dark to keep others from falling through the cracks. He didn't mention his son, not in that setting, and I respected that choice. It wasn't about his personal debt, not anymore. It was about the legacy he intended to create from the ground up. When it came time for discussion, I spoke clearly and deliberately, outlining a pilot initiative I had drafted in the days since his call, a mentorship pipeline for first-generation college graduates entering clinical and community-based roles, a program that would pair them with experienced professionals who understood not just policy, but the emotional labor and personal stakes involved in the work. I talked about burnout, about secondary trauma, about how retention in nonprofit mental health services was not a matter of passion, but of infrastructure. I didn't use buzzwords. I didn't dress it up in language meant to impress. I spoke the way I always had, with care, with clarity, and with a quiet kind of conviction that could only come from having sat across from people at their lowest and refused to look away. The board members responded not with polite nods, but with questions, serious, engaged, thoughtful. And by the time the meeting ended, 3 of them had already offered resources to help develop the program, while Richard himself promised seed funding from his personal fund. There was no applause. This wasn't theater. But when I stood up from that chair, I knew something had changed. Not just in that room, but in the narrative that had followed me for most of my life. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, Richard walked me to the elevator himself. The others lingered behind, still deep in conversation. He didn't say much, just a brief thank you and a comment about the sunlight finally breaking through the morning haze. But his presence beside me felt like a confirmation of something that had long gone unspoken. When the elevator doors opened, I turned to face him and said, "I'm not here to fix what's broken in other people. I'm here to stop the things that break them in the first place." He smiled, not wide, but real, and said, "That's exactly why you're here." The ride down was quiet, just me and the hum of the machinery. And as I descended floor after floor, I thought not of victories or vindication, but of balance. How long it had taken to arrive at a place where I could stand without flinching in my own name. At the ground floor, I stepped into the lobby, passing the same reception desk where I had sat weeks earlier, full of tension and expectation. This time, the receptionist greeted me by name, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just simple recognition. It felt like a small thing, but it landed deep. Outside, the city was buzzing in its usual cacophony of traffic and footsteps and fragments of conversation. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, holding the folder with the program draft tucked beneath my arm, and looked up at the building's mirrored exterior. The glass reflected everything, the movement, the chaos, the people rushing by, but in that reflection I saw myself clearly for once. Not smaller than anyone else, not overshadowed, not edited down to make someone else shine brighter, just me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen. "You probably don't remember me. I'm Alex. Thank you for not giving up on me. Not then. Not now." I stared at the message, fingers hovering above the keyboard. But I didn't type a response. I didn't need to. Some messages don't require answers. They just need to land. As I walked down the block, slipping into the rhythm of the city, I felt the silence Ava had once feared begin to echo around her instead. She had spent her whole life believing that the only way to matter was to be seen. I had learned, slowly and through fire, that sometimes the deepest kind of power is the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand the room, but changes it anyway, one quiet truth at a time. And in that quiet, at long last, I was no longer waiting for permission to be heard.